What if the most dangerous Soviet spy in America never touched a classified document, never planted a bug, and never met his handlers in dark alleys? What if he waited in a wooden box every Sunday morning while America's nuclear secrets walked through his door and confessed their sins? The spring of 1958 brought a crisis that paralyzed the Central Intelligence Agency's Counterintelligence Division in a way that neither the Berlin blockade nor the Korean War had managed to accomplish. Classified documents detailing the exact locations of Titan missile silos across Montana and Wyoming had appeared in Moscow within 72 hours of their distribution to exactly 17 officers at the Pentagon, and every single one of those officers had passed their polygraph examinations with results so clean that the examiners suspected the machines themselves had been compromised. The documents hadn't been photographed, or the seals on the safes hadn't been tampered with, and surveillance teams had confirmed that none of the 17 officers had made suspicious contacts or deviated from their normal routines during the critical period when the leak must have occurred. Director Alan Dulles convened an emergency task force that operated from a sealed conference room in the original headquarters building on E Street, where analysts worked in shifts around the clock, trying to solve an impossible equation. How does classified information travel from locked safes in the Pentagon to the Kremlin without anyone carrying it, copying it, or even touching it outside of authorized locations? Nathan Scott had spent 3 years in a Jesuit seminary in Boston before the outbreak of the Korean War convinced him that serving God required more immediate action than the contemplative life offered, leading him to enlist in Army intelligence, where his knowledge of Latin, canon law, and the intricate social networks of Catholic clergy made him invaluable for operations in Italy and occupied Austria. He spoke 4 languages fluently, including ecclesiastical Latin, and could recite the complete order of the Catholic Mass from memory, skills that seemed useless after his transfer to the CIA's Domestic Counterintelligence Division in 1956, until the morning when his supervisor placed a file on his desk containing photographs of 17 Pentagon officers who had nothing in common except their security clearances and their attendance at the same church. The Jesuit community at Georgetown University operated the Holy Trinity Catholic Church on N Street, where a rotating group of priests heard confessions every Saturday evening and Sunday morning, and all 17 officers had attended confession within 24 hours before the classified documents reached their desks. Scott's hands trembled slightly as he read the intercepts from a KGB communications channel that referenced an asset codenamed Bishop, who had provided what Moscow described as information obtained through spiritual counseling of American military personnel. The Georgetown neighborhood spread across the hills above the Potomac River, like a colonial village preserved in amber, its brick townhouses and cobblestone streets unchanged since the 1700s, except for the black sedans that delivered congressmen and military officers to the offices and clubs hidden behind ivy-covered walls. Scott arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, carrying forged credentials identifying him as a doctoral student in medieval theology who had been granted special permission to access the Georgetown University archives, which gave him legitimate reasons to spend time in the Jesuit residence hall and attend daily Mass at Holy Trinity Church without arousing suspicion. The church stood at the intersection of N and 36th Streets, a modest brick structure built in 1851 that could hold perhaps 300 worshippers, and Scott counted 6 confessionals positioned along the north and south walls of the nave, where priests sat in darkness for hours, listening to the sins and fears of parishioners who knelt behind wooden screens and whispered their secrets. He attended his first confession on Saturday evening and discovered that the priest behind the screen was Father Vladimir Grigoriev, a name that appeared in the personnel files as a Ukrainian Jesuit who had escaped from Poland during the Nazi occupation and joined the order in Rome before being assigned to Georgetown in 1952. Scott confessed to minor sins of pride and impatience while listening carefully to the priest's voice, noting the faint accent that suggested Eastern European origins, but nothing that indicated deception or unusual interest in extracting information beyond the spiritual guidance expected during the sacrament. The confession lasted exactly 4 minutes according to Scott's watch, and Father Grigoriev assigned a penance of 2 decades of the Rosary before dismissing him with the traditional absolution. Yet Scott felt a crawling sensation between his shoulder blades as he knelt in a pew and pretended to pray, while watching other parishioners enter and exit the confessionals throughout the evening. The breakthrough came on the third Sunday, when Scott positioned himself in the church basement during the 8 o'clock Mass and discovered that the ventilation system carried sound from the confessionals through the old heating ducts with remarkable clarity. He heard Father Grigoriev counsel a young woman about her difficulties with her mother-in-law, an elderly man about his anger toward his ungrateful children, and then a voice Scott recognized from surveillance recordings began speaking in the halting cadence of someone unburdening a terrible weight. Colonel Eric Baker from the Pentagon's Strategic Air Command Liaison Office described his fear that the missile deployments he was coordinating would lead to accidental nuclear war, and as he detailed his specific concerns about the Titan silos in Montana, he provided exact grid coordinates, deployment schedules, and the names of the officers responsible for each site. Father Grigoriev offered no unusual questions and provided standard spiritual comfort about trusting in God's plan, but Scott heard something else in the extended pauses between the priest's responses: the sound of a pencil moving rapidly across paper. Scott's hands shook as he transcribed the coordinates he had just heard. Father Grigoriev was writing during confession. The wooden confessional booth contained a concealed writing surface. Every classified detail was being recorded in real time. Footsteps echoed in the church above. Someone was coming down the basement stairs, moving fast. Scott had maybe 30 seconds before discovery. Scott rolled behind the furnace as the basement door opened, and footsteps descended the wooden stairs with the deliberate pace of someone who belonged there rather than someone searching for an intruder. He pressed himself against the brick wall where the furnace's bulk created a shadow deep enough to conceal a man, if that man remained absolutely motionless and controlled his breathing despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The footsteps belonged to an elderly Jesuit in a maintenance worker's coveralls who walked directly to a circuit breaker panel on the opposite wall, flipped 3 switches that restored power to what must have been the parish hall lights, and climbed back upstairs without ever glancing toward the heating ducts where Scott had been crouched moments earlier. Scott waited 15 minutes by his watch before emerging from behind the furnace, his legs cramping from the awkward position and his mind racing with the implications of what he had overheard in that confessional. The investigation shifted into a phase that required resources beyond what Scott could deploy without authorization from the highest levels of the agency, and within 48 hours, he was sitting in a windowless conference room beneath the E Street headquarters building, presenting his findings to a panel that included Alan Dulles himself and 2 Jesuits who had been brought in as consultants after signing security agreements that threatened them with prosecution under the Espionage Act if they revealed anything discussed in that room. Father Justin Adams served as the provincial superior for the Maryland Jesuit province and had known Vladimir Grigoriev since the Ukrainian priest's arrival in America in 1952, and he explained that Grigoriev's escape from Nazi-occupied Poland had been facilitated by the Vatican's refugee network through Rome, where he spent 3 years in formation before being ordained and assigned to Georgetown, based on his expertise in Slavic languages and medieval theology. The second Jesuit was Father Brandon Green, a canon lawyer who had reviewed Grigoriev's personnel file and confirmed that every detail of his biography aligned with records maintained by the Jesuit Curia in Rome, including testimonials from priests who had known him in Poland before the war and documentation of his theological training that showed no gaps or inconsistencies that might suggest a fabricated identity. Scott listened to their confident assurances about Grigoriev's legitimacy and felt the frustration building in his chest because he had heard that pencil moving across paper during confession, and no amount of bureaucratic verification could explain away the physical evidence of espionage occurring inside a Catholic sacrament. The technical surveillance team installed microphones in the confessionals during a Tuesday night operation that required picking the church locks and working in complete darkness to avoid alerting the 2 Jesuits who lived in the residence hall 50 yards away, and the audio equipment they concealed inside the wooden frames was sophisticated enough to capture not only conversations, but also ambient sounds, including the scratch of pencil on paper that Scott had described in his initial report. For 3 weeks, the team monitored every confession that Father Grigoriev heard, recording dozens of ordinary Catholics, admitting to ordinary sins like adultery and dishonesty and anger. But on the fourth Sunday, a Navy commander assigned to the Atlantic Fleet's Submarine Operations Office knelt in the confessional and described his moral anguish about the new Polaris missile system that would allow submarines to launch nuclear weapons without requiring confirmation from surface vessels or ground command. The commander provided technical details about the communication protocols and fail-safe mechanisms while seeking spiritual guidance about whether his participation in developing these systems constituted cooperation with evil, and the microphones captured the unmistakable sound of Father Grigoriev, writing continuously throughout the 10-minute confession, despite offering only minimal verbal responses to the commander's questions. Scott obtained authorization to search Grigoriev's living quarters in the Jesuit residence hall on a morning when the entire community was attending a province-wide meeting in Baltimore, giving him a 4-hour window to photograph everything in the small room that contained a single bed, a desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts in 6 languages, and a closet holding 4 black cassocks and 2 civilian suits that showed wear patterns consistent with years of use. He found nothing hidden in the mattress, or taped behind furniture, or concealed in the spines of books. And the desk contained only lecture notes for Grigoriev's theology classes and correspondence with other Jesuits discussing scholarly matters related to medieval church history. The search appeared to be a complete failure until Scott noticed that the books on the lowest shelf were arranged in a pattern that didn't match the logical organization of the upper shelves, and when he removed a Latin dictionary from the end of the row, he discovered that the shelf itself was hollow and contained a metal box welded to the wall studs behind the wooden facade. The box required 40 minutes of careful work, with a tension wrench and diamond pick before the lock yielded, and Scott's hands trembled as he lifted the lid and saw what lay inside on a bed of grey foam rubber. 23 small notebooks filled with handwritten notes in a mixture of Russian, and what appeared to be a simple substitution cipher sat stacked beside a miniature camera, no larger than a cigarette lighter, and 3 rolls of undeveloped film. Scott photographed every page of the first notebook using the Minox camera concealed in his belt buckle, and even without decryption, he could recognize the structured format of intelligence reports with dates, subject identifiers, and content summaries that corresponded exactly to the timeline when classified information had leaked from the Pentagon to Moscow. The notebooks contained 6 years of confessions from military officers who had unburdened their consciences to a priest they trusted, while unknowingly providing the Soviet Union with some of the most closely guarded secrets in the American defense establishment. The film rolls presented a different problem, because developing them would reveal their absence to Grigoriev and compromise the surveillance operation before Scott's team had identified the communication method that allowed the Ukrainian priest to transmit intelligence back to his KGB handlers. Scott photographed the film canisters from every angle and measured their exact dimensions before returning everything to the metal box and reconstructing the bookshelf arrangement precisely as he had found it. But as he was replacing the Latin dictionary in its position at the end of the row, he noticed a small pencil mark on the shelf edge that he had not observed during his initial examination. The mark consisted of 3 dots arranged in a triangle, and Scott's stomach clenched as he realized it might be a telltale indicator that would reveal tampering if Grigoriev checked it upon returning from Baltimore. He had 90 seconds to decide whether to leave the mark intact and hope Grigoriev didn't check it, or attempt to reproduce it and risk creating a visible difference that would be even more obvious. The residence hall's front door opened downstairs. Someone had returned early. Heavy footsteps climbed toward the 2nd floor. Scott grabbed his camera and moved toward the window that opened onto the fire escape. The footsteps stopped outside Grigoriev's door. A key turned in the lock. Scott went through the window as the door swung open. Scott dropped from the fire escape into the alley behind the residence hall and walked 3 blocks before allowing himself to break into a run toward the safe house on Wisconsin Avenue, where the technical team had established their monitoring station in the basement of a dry cleaning business. He arrived breathing hard and replayed the escape in his mind, while the team's photographer developed the film from his Minox camera. And 20 minutes later, they were examining high-resolution images of 23 pages from Grigoriev's first notebook, spread across a light table like evidence from a crime scene that would never see a courtroom. The entries began in January of 1952 and detailed confessions from military officers State Department officials and defense contractors who had sought spiritual guidance about their involvement in programs ranging from nuclear weapons development to psychological warfare operations in Eastern Europe. Each entry followed an identical format, with the date in the upper left corner. A single letter identifying the confessor that Scott's team would later match to surveillance photographs of parishioners entering and leaving the church, and detailed summaries of classified information presented in the original English rather than translated into Russian, suggesting that Grigoriev transmitted the raw intelligence to handlers who performed their own analysis and assessment of the material's value. The question that consumed the next 72 hours of round-the-clock analysis was how Grigoriev transmitted 23 notebooks worth of classified intelligence from Georgetown to Moscow without ever making contact with known KGB operatives or traveling outside the Washington metropolitan area under circumstances that would allow for a dead drop or brush pass. The surveillance team had maintained sporadic observation of the Ukrainian priest since Scott's initial discovery and had documented a routine so mundane that it bordered on theatrical in its normalcy. Daily Mass at 7 in the morning, theology lectures at the university 3 days per week, pastoral visits to elderly parishioners on Thursday afternoons, confession duty every Saturday evening and Sunday morning, and participation in the Jesuit community's evening prayers and communal meals. Without deviation or unexplained absences, Scott studied the surveillance logs and noticed that Grigoriev made exactly one trip per month to the Apostolic Nunciature on Massachusetts Avenue, where the Vatican maintained its diplomatic mission to the United States, and these visits occurred on the third Tuesday of each month, when Grigoriev served as a translator for meetings between the papal nuncio and visiting clergy from Eastern European countries who needed assistance communicating with American Catholic relief organizations. The nunciature enjoyed full diplomatic immunity under international law, and its outgoing mail pouches traveled to Rome via diplomatic courier without inspection by American customs officials or intelligence services. The realization hit Scott like a physical blow because it meant that Grigoriev had constructed an espionage apparatus that exploited two of the most sacred and legally protected institutions in Western civilization, the Catholic confessional and Vatican diplomatic immunity. Any attempt to intercept the mail pouches would constitute a violation of international treaties that had governed diplomatic relations since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and exposing Grigoriev's operation would require the CIA to admit that it had conducted surveillance inside a Catholic church and recorded confessions that were protected by both religious doctrine and the First Amendment's guarantee of free exercise of religion. Alan Dulles convened an emergency meeting in his 7th-floor office that included the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, and a Monsignor from the Vatican Secretariat of State, who had been flown in from Rome on 6 hours' notice. And Scott watched the implications of the Bishop case ripple through the room as each official grasped the political catastrophe that would unfold if the operation became public knowledge. The Secretary of State pointed out that accusing the Vatican of facilitating Soviet espionage would destroy American relations with Catholic countries throughout Latin America and Western Europe, at precisely the moment when the Church was serving as a crucial ally in resisting communist expansion, while the Attorney General warned that any prosecution of Grigoriev would require disclosure of surveillance methods that violated constitutional protections and would likely result in the case being dismissed and the CIA's domestic operations being subjected to congressional investigation. The Monsignor from Rome listened to 90 minutes of discussion before speaking for the first time, and his words carried the weight of an institution that had survived emperors and revolutions and wars by understanding when to compromise and when to stand firm. He explained that the Vatican had suspected for several years that communist intelligence services were attempting to infiltrate Catholic institutions and had been conducting its own quiet investigation of clergy who had escaped from Soviet-occupied territories, but the Church could not simply expel or discipline priests based on suspicion without evidence and canonical procedures that would take years to complete and would expose the Church to accusations of conducting witch hunts against Eastern European refugees. He proposed a solution that made Scott's skin crawl with its cold pragmatism: allow Grigoriev to continue his transmissions to Moscow, but feed him carefully constructed disinformation that would mislead Soviet strategic planning, while the Vatican quietly transferred him to a remote monastery, where he would spend the rest of his life in contemplative isolation without access to confession or contact with anyone who possessed classified knowledge. The plan would protect both American security interests and the Church's reputation, while avoiding a public scandal that would damage the Western alliance, and the only price would be allowing a Soviet spy to escape justice and continue believing that his treason had succeeded. Scott spent 3 days arguing against the compromise and insisting that Grigoriev should be arrested and prosecuted regardless of the political consequences, but his superiors made clear that the decision had already been reached at levels far above his authority, and that his role would be limited to managing the disinformation campaign that would feed false intelligence through the confession pipeline for the next 6 months. He accepted the assignment, with the bitter understanding that intelligence work often required sacrificing perfect justice for practical outcomes, and he began developing a strategy for planting Navy officers and Air Force personnel in Grigoriev's confession rotation, who would describe fictional weapons systems and fabricated deployment plans designed to waste Soviet resources on countermeasures against threats that did not exist. The operation ran smoothly through May and June of 1958, with Grigoriev dutifully recording the false confessions and transmitting them through the nunciature's diplomatic pouch, while Vatican officials prepared the paperwork that would transfer him to a Cistercian monastery in rural Kentucky, where he would take permanent vows of silence. Everything changed on the morning of July 9th, when Scott received an urgent call from the surveillance team reporting that Grigoriev had failed to appear for his scheduled confession duty and that his room in the Jesuit residence had been found empty, with all personal belongings removed except for a single envelope addressed to Nathan Scott and sealed with red wax bearing the imprint of a Russian Orthodox cross. Scott's hands shook as he broke the seal and unfolded a letter written in precise English on Georgetown University letterhead. The message contained 3 short paragraphs. Father Vladimir Grigoriev knew about the surveillance. He had known since Scott's search of his room 3 months earlier. The disinformation campaign had failed completely, and he was requesting a face-to-face meeting at a location where they could speak honestly about matters that transcended the Cold War game they had both been playing. The letter ended with specific instructions for Scott to come alone to the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception on Michigan Avenue at 8 o'clock that evening. Confessional number 7. Come prepared to hear a confession that would explain everything. The Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception rose above the Catholic University campus like a Byzantine fortress transplanted from Constantinople to the hills of northeast Washington, its massive dome visible for miles, and its interior capable of holding 6,000 worshippers, in a space designed to inspire awe and submission before the infinite. Scott arrived 30 minutes early and positioned himself in the upper church where he could observe the main entrance and the side chapels, watching the handful of evening visitors who wandered through the vast space lighting candles and whispering prayers, while he calculated the odds that Grigoriev had brought backup or planned to use the meeting as cover for an extraction to the Soviet embassy. The confessionals lined the lower level of the basilica in a semicircular arrangement behind the main altar, and number 7 stood at the far end near a side exit that opened onto 4th Street, offering a clear escape route that suggested Grigoriev had chosen the location with tactical considerations that went beyond symbolic religious significance. Scott descended the marble stairs to the lower church at 7:55 and found the space empty, except for an elderly woman kneeling in a pew near the Blessed Sacrament Chapel and a uniformed security guard making his rounds near the gift shop entrance. Confessional number 7 stood open with its purple curtain drawn back, revealing the simple wooden interior and the screen that separated priest from penitent. And as Scott approached, he saw a shadow move behind the priest's side of the booth, indicating that Grigoriev had arrived first and was waiting. Scott pulled the curtain closed behind him and knelt on the padded kneeler, and for a long moment neither man spoke, while the weight of what they both knew hung in the darkness between them, like a physical presence that made breathing difficult. Father Vladimir Grigoriev spoke first in English without the faint accent that Scott had noted during their previous encounter. his voice carrying the flat neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times and understood that every word mattered. He thanked Scott for coming alone and keeping his word despite having every tactical reason to bring a team and end the meeting with an arrest, and he explained that what he was about to reveal could not be shared through intermediaries or official channels because the truth was more complicated than the simple narrative of Cold War espionage that both the CIA and the KGB preferred to maintain. The man they knew as Vladimir Grigoriev had been born Vincent Green in Pittsburgh in 1914 to Irish Catholic parents who had sent their son to seminary at age 16 with dreams that he would serve God and bring honor to a family that had climbed from poverty through faith and hard work. And by 1938, he had been ordained as a Jesuit priest and assigned to the order's mission in Warsaw, where he taught theology and ministered to Polish Catholics in the years before. The Nazi invasion transformed Europe into hell. The Nazi occupation of Poland had destroyed Father Vincent Green in ways that went beyond the physical suffering and forced labor that thousands of priests endured during the war years, because the specific horror that broke his faith occurred in the basement of a Gestapo headquarters building in Krakow, where he was forced to watch the interrogation and execution of 12 members of his parish who had been arrested for hiding Jewish children in the church sacristy. The Gestapo officer conducting the interrogation had demanded that Father Green convince the parishioners to reveal the locations of other Jews being hidden throughout the city, arguing that cooperation would save their lives and allow them to receive proper Catholic burial rather than being dumped in mass graves like animals. And Father Green had counseled them to remain silent and accept martyrdom as witness to Christ's teaching about protecting the innocent and defenseless. The Gestapo had executed all 12 parishioners in front of Father Green, and then released him with the explanation that they wanted him to live with the knowledge that his religious principles had achieved nothing except adding 12 more corpses to the millions already stacked across occupied Europe, like cordwood awaiting burning. Father Green survived the war and returned to Rome in 1945, carrying psychological wounds that no amount of prayer or theological study could heal, and it was during his recovery period in a Jesuit house near the Vatican that an NKVD officer approached him with a proposition that exploited his shattered faith with surgical precision. The Soviet officer, who identified himself only as Valentin, explained that he had access to Father Green's complete wartime record, including testimony from Polish resistance members confirming his courage and integrity, and Valentin proposed that the priest could honor the memory of those 12 murdered parishioners by ensuring that no future war would allow such atrocities to occur again through the simple expedient of helping the Soviet Union monitor American military capabilities and prevent the United States from achieving the kind of overwhelming strategic advantage that would enable aggressive action against the socialist world. The argument worked because Father Green no longer believed that God intervened in human affairs, or that prayer and moral witness could prevent the strong from crushing the weak, and he accepted recruitment by the NKVD with the rationalization that espionage in service of preventing World War III represented a more practical form of protecting the innocent than the theological abstractions that had failed so completely in Nazi-occupied Poland. The transformation from Vincent Green to Vladimir Grigoriev had been accomplished through a combination of forged documents and the chaos of post-war refugee movements that allowed the NKVD to create a complete legend based on the genuine history of a Ukrainian priest who had died in a Soviet labor camp in 1943. Father Green spent 3 years in formation, relearning his own faith from the perspective of his new identity. And by 1952, when he arrived at Georgetown University, the metamorphosis was complete enough to fool even Jesuit superiors who were trained to detect deception and inconsistency in candidates for the priesthood. He had operated successfully for 6 years, collecting intelligence through the confessional, and the psychological burden of violating the sacrament while maintaining his public role as spiritual counselor had gradually become unbearable in ways that his NKVD training had not prepared him to manage. Scott listened to the confession without interrupting, and felt his carefully maintained categories of loyalty and treason beginning to blur in ways that terrified him, because accepting Grigoriev's narrative meant acknowledging that the Cold War was not a simple conflict between good and evil, but rather a collision between different forms of pragmatism, each claiming moral authority. He asked the question that had been building since the beginning of Grigoriev's story. Why reveal everything now, when the operation was still secure, and the disinformation campaign had created the perfect cover for continued espionage? Grigoriev's answer came after a long pause during which Scott heard something that might have been a suppressed sob, or simply the sound of a man gathering courage to speak a truth that would destroy him. Grigoriev explained that he had discovered faith again, not through prayer or theological study, but through listening to the genuine anguish of military officers who confessed their fears about nuclear weapons and questioned whether their service to national security required them to abandon basic human decency. These men were not the cartoon villains of Soviet propaganda, but rather ordinary people struggling with extraordinary moral burdens, and their confessions had gradually convinced Grigoriev that his NKVD handlers were wrong about American intentions, and that the intelligence he provided was not preventing war, but rather feeding Soviet paranoia that made conflict more likely. He had decided 6 months earlier to end his cooperation with Moscow, and had deliberately allowed Scott to discover the evidence in his room as a way of forcing a confrontation that would end the operation without requiring him to betray his handlers directly. Scott understood with sudden clarity that Grigoriev was offering him a choice that paralleled the one the priest had faced in Krakow during the war: remain silent and preserve institutional interests at the cost of individual justice, or speak the truth and accept the consequences that would damage everyone involved. If Scott arrested Grigoriev and exposed the operation, the resulting scandal would destroy American-Vatican relations and provide Soviet propaganda with evidence that the Catholic Church had been penetrated at the highest levels. If Scott allowed Grigoriev to disappear quietly, the priest would spend the rest of his life in some form of comfortable exile, while the CIA buried the case and continued its own violations of civil liberties in the name of national security. Scott made his decision in the darkness of that confessional booth and spoke words that would haunt him for the remaining 43 years of his life. He told Grigoriev to leave the United States within 24 hours and never contact anyone from his former life, and in exchange, Scott would report that the Bishop case had been a false alarm based on misinterpreted surveillance and that Father Vladimir Grigoriev had returned to Rome for health reasons unrelated to any security concerns. The lie would protect both institutions and allow Grigoriev to seek whatever redemption he believed possible. But the price would be Scott's own integrity and his knowledge that he had chosen pragmatism over principle, exactly as Grigoriev had done 13 years earlier. Father Vladimir Grigoriev disappeared from Georgetown on July 10, 1958, and Vatican records show that he transferred to a Trappist monastery in southern France, where he lived under his birth name Vincent Green until his death from heart failure in 1984 at age 70. The monastery's abbot reported that Father Green spent his final 26 years in almost complete silence, emerging from his cell only for communal prayers and meals, and that he left behind 17 handwritten volumes of theological reflections on the nature of betrayal and forgiveness that the order has never published or allowed scholars to examine. Nathan Scott remained with the CIA until his retirement in 1979 and spent the next 3 decades teaching intelligence history at Georgetown University in the same buildings where Grigoriev had once operated, living 3 blocks from Holy Trinity Church, where he attended Mass every Sunday morning and never once entered a confessional booth. He died in January of 2001 without ever revealing the truth about the Bishop case to his wife or children, though colleagues reported that he kept a photograph in his office desk showing the Basilica of the National Shrine taken from the exact angle that would have been visible from confessional number 7. The 23 notebooks that Scott photographed in Grigoriev's room disappeared from CIA archives sometime in the early 1960s, and official records indicate that the Bishop investigation was closed due to lack of evidence after surveillance failed to identify any actual security breaches at the Pentagon or Georgetown. The disinformation campaign that Scott had managed in the spring of 1958 did succeed in misleading Soviet strategic planning for approximately 18 months, as declassified KGB documents from the 1990s reveal that Moscow invested significant resources developing countermeasures against fictional weapons systems that existed only in the carefully constructed lies that military officers had whispered in Grigoriev's confessional. The Cold War continued for another 31 years after that July evening in Washington, and the conflicts between faith and pragmatism that had destroyed both Grigoriev and Scott were replayed in thousands of other lives on both sides of the Iron Curtain as ordinary people made impossible choices in service of institutions that demanded absolute loyalty while offering only ambiguous moral guidance in return.